Dog dug up, 1920s safe in Montana. Nobody could crack it until the old blacksmith showed up. The late October sun in Gallatin County has a way of telling you winter's just around the corner, waiting its turn behind the Bridger Mountains. It's a low, golden light that doesn't so much warm you as it does illuminate the coming cold. It catches the gold of the turning cottonwood leaves, making them glitter like 1,000 tiny coins against a sky so blue it hurts your eyes. I was 48 years old, and I'd seen that same light paint these rolling hills every autumn of my life, just as my father and his father before him had. The Bitterroot Ranch wasn't just land to me. It was the grit under my fingernails, the ache in my lower back, and the steady, quiet rhythm of my own heart. That afternoon, I was riding fence line on the southeastern pasture, the one that slopes down toward the creek. My Australian shepherd, Scout, trotted alongside my quarter horse, Dusty. Scout's mind was a map of this ranch, every draw and coulee etched into his brain. His mottled blue merle coat blended with the long shadows, and the only thing that gave him away was the white tip of his tail, bobbing like a fisherman's lure through the tall grass. He was more than a dog. He was my four-legged conscience, my shadow, and on most days, the best conversationalist I had. We were making good time, checking for breaks in the wire that the last of the elk herds might have pushed through on their way to lower ground. It was quiet work, the kind that lets a man's mind wander. The air smelled of curing grass, cold earth, and the faint, dusty scent of cattle. The only sounds were the creak of my saddle leather, the soft thud of Dusty's hooves, and the steady panting of a happy dog on the job. We came up on the old cottonwood, the giant that stood sentinel near the creek bend. Its trunk was as wide as my pickup, its bark a gnarled and deeply grooved landscape of its own. Generations of Callahans had carved their initials into it. My own TC from when I was 10 years old now weathered and stretched into a soft, blurry memory. I'd passed this tree 10,000 times and never given it more than a passing glance. But today was different. Scout, who was usually a dozen yards ahead sniffing out gopher holes, stopped dead. His ears went up, his body tensed. He let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of intense, focused curiosity. He lowered his head and sniffed at the base of the tree, his tail dropping straight and still. "What is it, boy?" I murmured, reining Dusty to a halt. "Coyote den?" He ignored me. His front paws started to work at the dirt, first tentatively, then with a frantic energy that was unlike him. Dirt and clumps of grass flew out behind him in powerful arcs. This wasn't the playful digging for a vole. This was a dog with a purpose, a dog who had found something that, in his world, mattered deeply. "Hey, settle down. You'll wear yourself out for nothing." He just dug harder, whining with effort. A patch of dark, rich soil turned into a rapidly deepening hole. I sighed, dismounted, and looped Dusty's reins over a low branch. The things you do for a good dog. I figured I'd let him tire himself out, then we'd get back to work. I leaned against the ancient trunk, pulling a blade of grass to chew on, watching the one-dog excavation project. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The hole was now deep enough to swallow Scout up to his shoulders. I was about to call him off for good when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the soft thud of a paw hitting a root or a rock, but a dull, metallic thunk. Scout yelped, a sound of frustrated triumph, and started scratching at the object, his nails scraping against something hard. Now my curiosity was piqued. I walked over and peered into the hole. There, covered in a century's worth of Montana soil, was the corner of something man-made. It was dark, rusted, and square. "Well, I'll be," I said aloud. Scout looked up at me, his muzzle caked in dirt, his intelligent eyes seeming to say, "See? I told you so." I grabbed the small trenching shovel I keep tied to my saddle. It wasn't much, but it was better than my bare hands. I started digging around the perimeter Scout had started, clearing the dirt away. The more I dug, the more of it I revealed. It wasn't just a box. It was a safe. A heavy iron safe with a round dial on the front and a thick, formidable handle. It was pitted with rust, the kind that flakes off in your hands like dried blood. But beneath it, the steel was solid. It was wedged deep in the earth, tangled in the thick, stubborn roots of the old cottonwood, as if the tree itself had been standing guard over it. It had to have been there for an eternity. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air ran down my spine. This land had been in my family since the Homestead Act. We thought we knew its every secret, every rise and fall of its terrain. But this was different. This was a secret the land itself had held, a secret my dog had just unearthed. I looked from the impossible iron box back to Scout, who sat panting proudly, his tail now wagging a slow, satisfied rhythm. He'd done more than just find a buried piece of metal. He'd dug up a question, one that was now rooted deeper in my mind than the safe was in the ground. Getting that beast out of the earth was a bigger chore than branding 100 head of calves in a hailstorm. It took me the rest of the afternoon and a whole lot of sweat just to clear the roots and dirt from around it. The safe was maybe 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, and it felt like it was bolted straight to the center of the planet. I tried to pry it with the shovel, then a crowbar from my truck's toolbox. It didn't budge. Finally, I had to give in and call for help. My nearest neighbor, Bill Henderson, lived 2 miles down the gravel road. Bill was a man built like a Hereford bull with hands that could crush walnuts and a heart to match. When I told him over the phone what Scout had found, there was a long pause. "You're pulling my leg, Tom," he finally said. "My leg's too tired for pulling, Bill. I'm looking right at it." Another pause. "I'll get the tractor." He showed up 20 minutes later in his big green John Deere, its engine chugging a steady rhythm in the quiet afternoon. He stood at the edge of the hole, hands on his hips, and let out a low whistle. "Good Lord, Tom, what in Sam Hill?" "Your guess is as good as mine," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a dirty glove. It took the two of us, a set of heavy logging chains, and the full hydraulic power of Bill's tractor to finally break the safe free from the ground's grip. It came up with a great sucking sound, tearing roots as thick as my arm. We loaded it onto the flatbed of my Ford F-250, the suspension groaning under the weight. I swear the truck sank a good 6 inches. Back at my barn, we wrestled it onto the concrete floor. The sound it made when it landed echoed through the cavernous space. A deep, resonant boom that startled the pigeons nesting in the rafters. Scout, who had followed the entire operation with intense focus, circled it twice, sniffed the rusted dial, then laid down a few feet away, his chin on his paws, as if to say his part of the job was done, and it was all on me now. Bill and I stood there, catching our breath, just looking at it. It was a relic from another time. The front was adorned with faded, ornate pinstriping, barely visible under the rust. A small brass plate identified the maker: McGraw's Forge and Ironworks, Bozeman, MT. The dial was intricate, with numbers and letters worn smooth by time. "Well," Bill said, breaking the silence, "let's get this thing open." That, it turned out, was easier said than done. We started with the simple stuff. We pulled and twisted on the handle. Nothing. We tried to figure out the combination, spinning the dial randomly, listening for a click that never came. Then we moved on to brute force. Bill fetched a sledgehammer from his truck. He swung it like he was driving a fence post, and the hammer bounced off the safe with a deafening clang that made my ears ring. All it left was a small, shiny dent in the rust. "This thing's built like a bunker," he grunted, shaking the sting out of his hands. We tried a drill with a hardened steel bit. The bit smoked, turned cherry red, and then snapped. We tried a crowbar in the seam of the door, putting our combined weight on it until the bar started to bend. The safe didn't even flinch. It just sat there on my barn floor, a silent, stubborn mystery, mocking our modern tools and muscle. News in a place like Gallatin County travels faster than a prairie fire with a tailwind. By the next morning, half the valley had heard about Tom Callahan's mystery safe. My phone started ringing before the coffee was brewed. Friends, neighbors, even folks I hadn't talked to in years, were calling with theories and advice. "It's probably Old Man Hemlock's gold," said Earl, who ran the feed store. "They say he buried his fortune before the banks crashed in '29 and never told a soul where." "Nah, it's bootlegger stuff," countered Dale, a rancher from up the valley. My granddad used to tell stories about the Canadian whiskey runners who used these parts as a layover, said they had hideouts all over. Before noon, a small crowd had gathered at the ranch. They stood around the safe in my barn like it was some kind of holy relic, their pickups parked haphazardly in the yard. Everyone had a story, a theory. Old Maeve, who'd been running the diner in town since the dawn of time, showed up with a thermos of coffee and a box of donuts. She peered at the safe through her thick glasses. My mother used to talk about the Roaring Twenties, she said, her voice thin and reedy. Said it was a wild time here. People had money from the mines and the ranches, but there was nowhere to put it they trusted. Government men were always snooping around. Sheriff Brody even came by, not in his official capacity, but just as a curious neighbor. He was a young guy, barely 30, and he looked at the safe with a kind of boyish wonder. He ran a hand over its rough surface. "We could try some thermite," his deputy suggested, a little too eagerly. Brody shot him a look. "Let's not blow up Tom's barn, Rick. This is history, not a bank job." The safe had become more than just a locked box. It was a focal point for the whole community's imagination. It held not just whatever was inside it, but all the stories and secrets of the generations that had come before us. And the more we failed to open it, the more legendary it became. A guy from Bozeman who ran a locksmith business came out with a fancy bore scope and a set of specialized tools. He spent 3 hours listening, probing and cursing under his breath before he finally packed up his gear, shaking his head. "I've opened modern bank vaults easier than this," he confessed, wiping grease from his hands. "The mechanism is old, but it's a masterpiece of gears and tumblers. It's frozen solid with age. Without the combination or the original key, you'll need to be a magician." The frustration was starting to eat at me. I had a ranch to run, cows to feed, fences to mend, a winter's worth of hay to stack. But my mind was tethered to that iron box on my barn floor. Every spare moment I'd find myself out there just staring at it, Scout lying faithfully at my feet. The dog seemed to understand my obsession. He'd nudge my hand with his cold, wet nose as if encouraging me not to give up. He'd started this after all. That night, after a long day of feeling useless, I sat down at the old roll-top desk in my study. It had belonged to my father and his father, Thaddeus, before him. I pulled out the old family albums and Thaddeus's journals. He was my great-grandfather, the one who had built this ranch from a patch of dirt and a homesteader's dream. The photos showed a stern-faced man with a heavy mustache and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many hard winters. His journal entries were sparse, mostly notes on cattle prices, rainfall, and the birth of a new foal. He wasn't a man for prose. October 12, 1923. Sold 40 head at market. Prices down. Winter will be lean. May 5, 1924. Lost the gray mare to colic. A good horse. A hard loss. I spent hours poring over the brittle, yellowed pages, the scent of old paper filling the small room. I was looking for a clue, any hint of a hidden safe or a secret fortune. But there was nothing. Just the simple, hard-won chronicle of a rancher's life. Dejected, I decided to take a different tack. The next morning, I drove into Bozeman to the public library. The archives were in the basement. A cool, quiet room that smelled of dust and preservation chemicals. I started pulling microfilms of the old Bozeman Daily Chronicle from the 1920s. I scrolled through endless pages of fuzzy black and white print, my eyes burning from the strain. I read about local politics, society gatherings, and the growing pains of a frontier town trying to become a city. And then I found it, a small article from November 1925, tucked away in the back pages. Federal agents raid Ridge Distillery. The story was brief. It detailed a raid by Prohibition agents on an illegal still operation in the foothills of the Bridgers, not 5 miles from my ranch. It talked about the resilience of the local bootleggers and the difficulty the Federals had in stamping out the trade. It mentioned that several local businesses were suspected of helping the moonshiners launder their money. There were no names, no specifics. It was just a whisper of the clandestine world that had existed right under my family's noses. It wasn't much, but it felt like a thread. I kept scrolling, my heart beating a little faster. A few pages later, I saw an advertisement. It was for a local business with a simple, stark drawing of an anvil and a hammer. McGraw's Forge and Ironworks. For all your needs in steel, plows, gates, and custom forgings, specialists in unbreakable strongboxes, your security is our craft. I stared at the name. McGraw's Forge. The same name that was on the brass plate on the safe. The ad was a boast, a promise of security in an uncertain time. An unbreakable strongbox, they weren't kidding. The thread was getting thicker. This wasn't some random prospector's box, it was made right here in Bozeman. And it was made for someone who had something serious to protect during one of the most lawless periods in Montana's history. The question was, who, and why bury it under the oldest tree on my family's land? I drove back to the ranch with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just trying to crack a safe anymore. I was trying to crack a story. My family's story. When I got home, Scout greeted me at the door, his tail wagging. I knelt and scratched him behind the ears. "We're getting closer, boy," I told him. "I can feel it." He just looked at me with those knowing eyes, as if he'd been waiting for me to catch up. The days turned into a week, and the safe in my barn became something of a local landmark. People would stop by on their way into town. Just to have a look, they'd say. They'd shake their heads, offer another piece of useless advice, and drive away, leaving me alone with the silent iron sentinel. My frustration was mounting. The ranch chores were piling up, and the first snow was forecast for the end of the week. This mystery, which had started as an exciting curiosity, was now a heavy weight on my shoulders. I decided to go back to the one person I thought might hold a key that wasn't made of metal, Maeve. I found her at the diner during the mid-afternoon lull, polishing silverware behind the counter. The place smelled of coffee, bacon, and a lifetime of stories. I sat down at the counter and she poured me a cup of coffee without asking. "Still haven't gotten into that treasure chest of yours, I hear," she said, her smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Not even close," I admitted. "But I found a name, McGraw, the forge that built it." Maeve stopped polishing and looked at me, her expression turning thoughtful. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "Jasper McGraw," she said, the name spoken like an incantation. "They called him Ironhand, not just because he worked with it. They said the man could feel the soul of metal. He could make a lock that only he could talk into opening." My heart skipped a beat. They said, "He's gone then." Oh heavens, I'd think so. He'd be 100 years old if he was a day. He was an old man when I was a girl. Quiet fella, kept to himself, especially during Prohibition. My father used to say that if you had a secret in Gallatin County you wanted to keep safe, you didn't put it in a bank. You put it in a McGraw box. She paused, her eyes looking past me into a memory. Never heard what became of him. The forge closed down in the 40s. I think he had a son, but he moved away. It was another dead end, a ghost of a memory. I thanked Maeve for the coffee and was about to leave when old Jedediah Smith, a retired rancher who spent most of his days occupying a corner booth at the diner, cleared his throat. "McGraw," he rasped, his voice gravelly from years of dust and cheap cigars. "His grandson lives up in the Bridgers, Daniel, woodworker, keeps to himself, just like the old man." Every head in the diner turned to look at him. Jedediah wasn't one for conversation, and a piece of information from him was as rare as a warm day in January. "You know where?" I asked, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. He took a long sip of his coffee. "Find the old logging road off Brackett Creek. Follow it till you think you're lost. Then go another mile. You'll see a mailbox shaped like a bluebird." The directions were as cryptic as the safe's combination, but they were the best lead I had. The next morning, with Scout riding shotgun in the pickup, I headed for the mountains. The paved road turned to gravel, then to a rutted dirt track that climbed steeply into the pine and aspen forest. The air grew colder, thinner. Just when I was sure I was hopelessly lost, I saw it. A small, hand-carved wooden bluebird sitting atop a mailbox post. A narrow lane led back into the trees. At the end of it was a modest cabin with smoke curling from a stone chimney. Next to it stood a large workshop, the scent of fresh-cut cedar hanging in the air. A man in his late 60s with a thick gray beard and Jasper McGraw's clear blue eyes came out onto the porch. He held a wood-carving knife in one hand and watched me with a wary, guarded expression. This had to be Daniel. I got out of the truck, Scout staying put but watching intently through the window. "Mr. McGraw?" I called out. "My name is Tom Callahan. I was hoping I could talk to you about your grandfather." He didn't invite me in. He just stood there waiting. I told him the whole story. Scout's digging, the safe, the maker's plate, the unbreakable lock. I described the ornate dial and the faded pinstriping. As I spoke, his guarded expression softened, replaced by a flicker of recognition. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "My grandfather is still alive," he said finally, his voice quiet. "He's 99 years old. He lives here with me." I felt a surge of hope so strong it almost buckled my knees. Is there any way I could speak with him? Show him the safe? Daniel shook his head slowly. "I don't know. His mind, it isn't always here. Some days he's sharp, remembers every detail of his life. Other days, he's back in 1930 and doesn't know who I am. It can be hard on him, dredging up the past. I've spent my life protecting him from things that might upset him. This was a new kind of lock, one of loyalty and love. I couldn't just force my way through it. I had to earn my way in." "I understand," I said, my voice sincere. "But this safe, it feels important. It's part of my family's history, and it feels like he's the only one who holds the key. The land my family has ranched for 5 generations, it holds stories. This is one of them. I just want to know how it ends." I talked about the Bitterroot, about what it meant to carry on a legacy. I spoke not as a treasure hunter, but as a son of the soil, just like his grandfather had been. Daniel listened, his gaze drifting from me to my dusty truck, to the mountains that framed the valley below. Scout, as if sensing the delicate nature of the moment, let out a soft whine from the truck. Daniel's eyes found the dog. He studied him for a moment. "An Aussie?" "Yes, sir, named Scout." A faint smile touched his lips. "Granddad always had a dog, said they were better than most people at keeping secrets." He looked back at me, a decision made. "All right, Mr. Callahan, you can talk to him, but you be gentle, and don't be disappointed if he can't help you." He led me inside the cabin. It was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old books. And there, sitting in a worn leather armchair by a crackling fire, was a man who looked as ancient and timeless as the mountains outside. His skin was like tanned parchment, stretched thin over the sharp bones of his face. His hands resting on the arms of the chair were gnarled with arthritis, but there was a latent strength in their grip. His eyes were pale and cloudy, and they seemed to be looking at a world only he could see. This was Jasper Ironhand McGraw. Daniel knelt beside him. "Granddad," he said softly. "This is Tom Callahan. He has something he wants to ask you about, something you made a long time ago." Jasper didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the dancing flames. I felt my hope begin to fade. This was a long shot, maybe too long. I knelt down on the other side of the chair, careful not to crowd him. "Mr. McGraw," I began, my voice quiet. "My dog found something on my ranch, an old safe." I described it in detail, the feel of the cold iron, the weight of it, the way the dial was worn smooth. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone and swiped to a picture I'd taken of the safe in the barn, a close-up of the lock and the maker's plate. I held it out for him. "This," I said. "You made this." For the first time, his eyes shifted. They moved slowly from the fire to the glowing screen of the phone. He squinted, his focus sharpening. His hand, trembling slightly, reached out, and he took the phone from me. He held it close to his face, his thumb brushing over the image of the dial. A flicker of light appeared deep in his cloudy eyes, a memory stirring from a long, deep sleep. "The Guardian," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The Gallatin Guardian." Daniel and I exchanged a stunned look. Jasper's gaze became clear, focused. He was looking at me now, really seeing me. "I made 12 of them," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "During the Troubles, for men who had things to protect. From the revenue men, from thieves, from each other. Each lock was different. A puzzle. Only I knew the steps." He handed the phone back to me, his eyes now holding a shrewd intelligence that defied his age. "You're on the old Bitterroot spread, then?" "Yes, sir. My family's owned it since the homestead." He nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Your name is Callahan?" "Tom Callahan." "Thaddeus Callahan's blood," he stated. It wasn't a question. I remember him, a hard man, but honest. He was in a bind. The ranch was close to going under. Drought, bad prices. He didn't want to, but he made a deal. Let some fellas from up north use a corner of his land to age their whiskey before running it south. They paid him well. He needed a place to keep his share, and theirs, where no one would find it. Jasper's eyes drifted back to the fire. "He was a good man, Thaddeus. He was just trying to save his home. He had me build that safe and bury it where only he and the oldest tree on his property would know the secret." A wave of understanding washed over me. This wasn't about a gangster's loot or a hidden fortune. It was about survival. It was about my great-grandfather doing what he had to do to ensure that I, his descendant, would one day be able to stand on this same land. "Can you open it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jasper looked from me to his grandson. A look of fierce pride of an old artist asked to perform one last time settled on his face. "A man should always be able to undo his own work," he said. "Get me my coat." Getting Jasper McGraw to the Bitterroot Ranch was like preparing for a visit from royalty. Daniel was protective, ensuring his grandfather was warm and comfortable for the drive down from the mountains. When they arrived, word had already spread. A small, respectful crowd of neighbors had gathered, parked at a distance, their curiosity tempered by a sense of reverence for the moment. They knew they were about to witness the closing of a chapter in Gallatin County history. I had cleared the barn, leaving only the safe sitting in a pool of light from the high windows. Scout was at my side, a quiet, watchful presence. He seemed to understand the gravity of the day. Daniel helped his grandfather out of the truck. Jasper moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but his back was straight and his eyes were sharp and clear. He was no longer a frail old man lost in memories. He was Jasper Ironhand McGraw, master blacksmith, and he was on his way to a reunion with an old friend. He walked into the barn and stopped a few feet from the safe. He didn't touch it right away. He just stood there, studying it, his head tilted slightly. It was a silent communion between a creator and his creation. The crowd outside was utterly silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn walls. Finally, he stepped forward. He handed his cane to Daniel and knelt down, his old joints protesting with a soft groan. He ran his gnarled, leathery fingers over the rusted surface of the safe, tracing the faint lines of the pinstriping. It was a touch that was both tender and knowing. He was reading the safe's story with his fingertips. He placed his hands on the dial, his eyes closed. He wasn't looking at the numbers, he was feeling them. His fingers began to move, turning the dial with a slow, deliberate rhythm. A quarter turn to the right, a soft click. A full turn to the left, stopping on a number only he could sense. Back to the right. It was a dance, a conversation conducted in the silent language of steel and brass. Minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an hour. The tension in the barn was thick enough to taste. He would stop, listen, his ear pressed against the cold metal, then begin the slow turning again. He tapped the door in specific spots, the dull thuds echoing in the silence. It was a craft that no modern tool could replicate. It was a connection born of muscle memory, of a secret locked not in the safe but in the man's own hands for 80 years. I held my breath. Scout let out a low, soft whine, pressing against my leg. Jasper paused, his hand resting on the dial. He seemed to be concentrating, gathering his strength. He looked over at me and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned back to the safe. He gave the dial one final, sharp twist to the right. Clack. The sound was as loud and definitive as a gunshot in the silent barn. It was a sound of release, of a secret finally surrendering. The mechanism, frozen for nearly a century, had yielded. Jasper took a deep breath and sagged back on his heels, a look of profound exhaustion and satisfaction on his face. He had done it. He had undone his own work. "There," he rasped, his voice filled with pride. "She's open." I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I gripped the thick, cold handle. It resisted for a moment. Then, with a groan of protesting rusted metal, the massive door began to swing open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over me, the smell of time itself. It smelled of dry paper, old leather, and something faintly sweet, like aged whiskey. The crowd outside surged forward, craning their necks to see. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved, untouched by the decades of moisture and frost they had endured. There were several stacks of coins, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Carefully, I lifted one out. I unwrapped it to reveal a column of heavy silver dollars, their surfaces still gleaming. Morgan and Peace dollars minted in the 1920s, a small fortune even then. Next to the coins were 3 thick, dark green glass bottles, their corks sealed with a deep red wax. Handwritten labels were pasted on them, the ink faded but still legible. Bridger Creek Reserve, one read. Aged 10 years. This was it. The moonshine, a liquid time capsule from the height of Prohibition. But it was the last item that made my breath catch in my throat. It was another oilcloth bundle, smaller than the others. I unwrapped it to find a leather-bound ledger, and tucked inside it a letter. The envelope was brittle and yellowed, and the handwriting on the front was achingly familiar from the journals I'd been reading. It said, simply, "To my son." My hands trembled as I opened it. It was from my great-grandfather, Thaddeus Callahan. "My dearest Robert." The letter began, addressed to my grandfather. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the time has come for you to know the whole truth of how we kept this land. The years have been hard, harder than I ever thought they could be. The bankers are circling like wolves, and the sky has forgotten how to rain. A man is forced to make choices he never thought he'd face. I have done something of which I am not proud, but which I do not regret, for it has saved this ranch. It has saved your home." He went on to explain the deal with the bootleggers, the money, his fear of being caught, and his deeper fear of losing the land that his own father had broken his back to claim. The ledger detailed every dollar that went in and out, a meticulous accounting that proved his intent was not to get rich, but to get by. "This money is not a treasure," he wrote in the closing lines. "It is a tool. It is the sweat and risk that will see this family through the next drought, the next hard winter. Use it to hold on to this soil. Never let it go. This land is our blood and our bone. It is all we truly have. I buried this secret deep, trusting only God and the old cottonwood to keep it safe. I pray you will understand." Tears welled in my eyes as I finished reading. In that moment, the century between me and Thaddeus Callahan collapsed. He wasn't just a stern face in a black and white photograph anymore. He was a man, a father, a husband, who had made a desperate choice to protect his legacy. The safe didn't contain a gangster's fortune. It contained a father's love. I looked up at Jasper McGraw, who was watching me with knowing eyes. I looked at the faces of my neighbors, their expressions a mixture of awe and understanding. And I looked down at Scout, who sat patiently at my feet, the loyal dog who had started this whole journey by digging for a truth he somehow knew was there. He had unearthed more than a safe. He had dug up my family's soul. The discovery of the Gallatin Guardian changed everything. The story became a piece of local folklore overnight, told and retold in the diner, the feed store, and across ranch fences all over the valley. The silver dollars, after being appraised, were worth enough to pay off the ranch's debts and establish a trust that would ensure the Bitterroot could weather any storm the future might throw at it. Thaddeus's desperate gamble had paid off 80 years later. Historians from the university in Bozeman came out to see the safe and its contents. They treated the ledger and the whiskey with the reverence of archaeologists finding a pharaoh's tomb. The whiskey, they said, was an invaluable artifact of the Prohibition era, and the ledger was one of the most complete records of a rural bootlegging operation they'd ever seen. Our ranch became a quiet point of interest. We started offering small, respectful tours, telling the story of Thaddeus and Jasper. It brought in a modest, steady income that helped with the upkeep, but more than that, it connected us to the community in a new way. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the valley. It was a shared piece of our rugged, resilient history. Old rivalries between neighbors seemed to fade, replaced by a common pride in our heritage. A few weeks after the opening, on a quiet evening, I was sitting on my porch watching the first snowflakes of the season drift down and melt on the dry ground. The air was clean and cold, and the world felt peaceful. In my hand, I held a small glass containing a single ounce of the Bridger Creek Reserve. The amber liquid was smooth with the taste of oak, grain, and time itself. Scout lay at my feet, his head resting on my boot. I reached down and stroked his thick fur, his tail thumping a soft, steady rhythm against the wooden porch floor. I had Thaddeus's letter on the table beside me, and I'd read it a dozen times. Each time I felt a deeper connection to the man, to the sacrifices he'd made. He wasn't a criminal. He was a rancher. He was a Callahan. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, to the silhouettes of the mountains that had watched over my family for 5 generations. A toast to Thaddeus. A toast to Jasper McGraw, whose hands had held the valley's secrets. And a toast to the land itself, which holds onto its stories until it's ready to let them go. Then I looked down at my loyal friend, the dog whose instincts had unlocked it all. He looked up at me, his brown and blue eyes full of an intelligence and loyalty that science will never be able to explain. He hadn't been digging for a safe. He had been digging for a story. Our story. "Good boy, Scout," I whispered, my voice thick with gratitude. "You brought it all home." He nudged my hand, and we sat there together in the falling snow, man and dog, watching the past and future of the Bitterroot Ranch settle into a quiet, peaceful balance. The secrets of the land had found their way home.